Exactly. Yeah, so my name's Matt Schweickle. I'm a associate lecturer here at the University of Wollongong in the Global Alliance for Mental Health and Sport, which is one of the research groups in the Centre for Health Psychology Practice and Research. So I sit within the School of Psychology and I teach sport and exercise psychology and introduction to psychology. So that's kind of my background, and I'll speak to that a little bit as we go through. So I guess just to start with, I wanted to provide an overview, and I think this would have probably been outlined in the poster thing that went around. But basically, what we'll go over today. So there's four sections, and we've obviously only got an hour, so I'll try to keep them as brief as I possibly can, while still being somewhat informative. But after each section, I will stop and just, if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask. About halfway through as well, I'll upload a document into the chat, which is a resources document. So that will have all the references, key papers that I've kind of drawn on to inform not only today's workshop, but also the workshop that I'll provide in September. So if you are worried about any of the papers or any of the kind of main resources I reference, that's where they'll be provided. But obviously, if you're looking for something specific, you can definitely reach out, and I'll be able to hopefully help. So I guess I just wanted to start with a little bit of a disclaimer of myself, is that qualitative research is a really big and diverse field. So really what I'll be talking about today and in the next session is kind of from my perspective and my experiences with qualitative research. So like I said, my background and my research area is really in sport and exercise psychology, particularly performance under pressure and mental health in sport. So they're my kind of two big research areas. So a lot of the things I'll talk about today, whilst they're probably very relevant to other areas of psychology, in particular applied and health psychology, and a lot of the readings and references that I've drawn from are quite widely used. Some of this also speaks to kind of my experiences in the field of sport and exercise psychology. So I just want to give that disclaimer that for some of these things, as with anything, it kind of differs by field. What's the expectations, what's the requirements, what the norms are. So it's always good to be aware of kind of, the journals that you're aiming to publish in, or the field that you're in, whether there might be any particular things you need to be aware of. Thankfully, sport and exercise seems to be a field which places a really high priority on qualitative research. So one of our best empirical journals is a qualitative specific journal. And there's a lot of qualitative methodological papers which are published from sport and exercise psychology authors. So it's a really popular type of research in the field, which means that to publish in this field, you've kind of got to be on top of some of the, I guess, requirements for qualitative research. So that's a little bit of a disclaimer, especially as I talk through some of the things around publishing and what you might need. And I guess just on top of that, a lot of what I'll kind of speak to and how it's kind of set up is like your method section that you would go about trying to publish a research paper, or if you're writing up an honours thesis or potentially a chapter of your PhD thesis. I've kind of set it out that way, and I'm really trying to focus on the key things you need to look out for when you go to publish. So what is qualitative research? So I'm sure most of you have a pretty good understanding already. But I guess one of the big things that stands out for me when I've kind of read about qualitative research, as well as writing qualitative research accounts, is kind of this focus on stories. So what I mean by that is you're often, listening to people's stories a lot. You're hearing their perspectives, their experiences, and then you're kind of providing your own story of those accounts. And you'll see qualitative results sections that they're much more kind of story based. You're trying to convey something about your research questions in a written format. So it's a bit more of that storytelling approach. It's a bit more trying to listen to people's stories and convey your own one. And then as part of that, you're really involved in the research process as the researcher. And I'll speak to that more kind of as we go through some of the philosophical assumptions, but probably a bit of a shift from, I guess, the quantitative approach where, the research is very independent. We are actively engaged in the process of kind of reflecting participant stories and our stories as well. Whoops. So more specifically, what is qualitative research? So I guess one of the biggest differences is that we're using words and sometimes images as data as opposed to numbers. So these can be written or spoken words. It seeks to understand phenomena in the meanings people bring to them. So there's a real focus on not only what people say, but the meaning people are trying to convey when they speak about something. Often we're generating narrow but rich data. And what I mean by narrow is smaller sample sizes than we would see in a quantitative paper. We might be looking 10, 15, 20, 30 participants, as opposed to quantitative papers where you might be looking in the hundreds for survey research. It seeks patterns in the data, but also explores differences and divergence. So we're really looking for the nuances and what's going on and what might be different, and not just is everything trending in one direction or the other. It values personal involvement and subjectivity. And this is, I guess, what I was talking about before, where it kind of values the role the researchers or the individual researcher brings to that data analysis and that qualitative paper in general. So all of us kind of bring our own biases, our own personal lens, theoretical lens that we're going to look at things through. And it really places the researcher as part of that process and also values that. The research method is often much more exploratory. So the research questions we ask, the interview questions we ask, for example, might change as the study progresses, depending on the type of data collection strategy, but it's not necessarily a replication. If you're an experiment, you're doing the same thing every single time and you don't want any deviation. Whereas in semi-structured interviews, for example, we might be asking slightly different questions every time we do an interview, because our understanding of that phenomena might evolve as we go along. And the research questions are often how, what, or why based. So really trying to understand what's going on, why things are happening, really going deep into trying to understand concepts and phenomena and really understanding the context that they're occurring in. So there's some of the key differences. Obviously, some of these are also the same in quantitative research. We can look at why questions in quantitative approaches as well. But these are some of the main areas where qualitative research, I guess, stands a bit different to quantitative approaches. So the first section I'm going to go through, which is, I will give the foreword in the probably most language heavy or, lots of terms I'm going to throw at you section. So I'll try to go through as slowly as possible. And if you do have any questions, please do feel free to ask. But this is this idea of methodological coherence. And this is basically how much our methods and the choices we make in our method section aligns with the philosophical approach we've outlined. So I'll speak to, I guess, the philosophy in a bit more detail, but here you can kind of see what I mean by that. So really your philosophical approach should link up with your approaches you take to data collection, how we sample participants, our data analysis strategy, our rigor, trustworthiness, validity, different terms are used for that, but basically how do we know that we've done a good qualitative research project, and the conclusions we draw about that data and what that means for future research. So that's all underlined by our philosophical position. So that's probably one of the biggest differences and potentially the most off-putting is probably the wrong terminology, but daunting parts of qualitative research papers is that we often need to talk about our philosophy. And at any research project, quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, whatever it is going to have certain philosophical assumptions already underneath that. But in qualitative research, we're often required to state those philosophical assumptions and make sure that it aligns throughout the research account, which is obviously something that's less common in quantitative approaches. And this is kind of where this idea comes from, is that you can't just pick and choose from any qualitative strategy, throw them all together and expect it to work out. And as the quote here says, this makes qualitative work sloppy and unscientific. So it's really about having a coherent research account, a coherent set of decisions that you've made that all link up with each other. Does the type of data you collected line up with your analysis strategy and the steps you've taken to ensure rigor or trustworthiness or validity? So I'm going to briefly talk about, I guess, the philosophical approaches that we can take. And this is where it does get a bit heavy with regards to terminology. But I guess the two primary things that we're focused on when we're talking about our philosophical approach is our ontology and our epistemology. So basically, the ontological question is the question around whether a social reality exists separately from our own practices and understandings about it. So this is the asking the question of, is there an objective reality out there that isn't dependent on our own constructions about it? And views on that will differ. And then the epistemological question is how we can gain knowledge of this reality. So how can what is assumed to exist be known? And then the combination of that ontological approach and epistemological approach is often referred to as your philosophy. Sometimes it's referred to as a meta theory, and I've even seen it being referred to as just theory. So it's just worth noting that different terms are used to refer to that kind of overarching approach. Now, there's a broad spectrum of philosophical approaches one can take when, I guess, approaching any scientific research study. And one of the most, I guess, tricky parts in this area is that these terms aren't always used consistently across different research studies. So, for example, post-positivism, you might have heard of, and I'll speak to that. But I've seen that defined and used with different ontological and epistemological assumptions across different papers. So it is somewhere where you really need to try to read into what the author's doing and understand the position they're coming from, rather than just necessarily grouping things together based on labels. So what I'm going to do here is just kind of provide a very high-level outline of where these different approaches sit with regards to their ontological and epistemological assumptions. And hopefully this will kind of help you get a bit of a grasp of where qualitative research is coming from and some of the options you may have. Now, I haven't broken these down into ontology and epistemology and how they kind of relate, because the labels get used inconsistently. I've just kind of grouped them broadly together just to give a high-level overview of kind of these different positions. So I'm going to start with the right side of this spectrum, and there's no right or wrong side. But I guess the one side of the spectrum is the approaches of realism, objectivism, and positivism. So these approaches adopt the view that there is a real reality that exists independently from our constructions about it, and that with the appropriate methods, we could come to know that reality in a fairly unbiased way. So what this does is separates the observer, us as the researcher, from the observed. We can approach the observed in a non-biased way, and we can know about it. And this is the approach that often underlies our quantitative methods. So an analogy for this, or a metaphor, which hopefully would help you understand this, is that if you were to imagine that you're sitting in this nice room and looking out at a garden, a kind of a realist, objectivist, positivist position would assume that you're looking out, you see the garden, and that the information that you see through this window corresponds exactly to what is outside. And if you were to go outside, you could verify that it corresponds to the reality that you're seeing. So you could feel the grass, you could smell the roses, you could, touch it. You can basically verify what you're seeing. So there's a reality that exists that's independent of us, and that we can then verify that reality through appropriate methods in a non-biased way. Then if we go to the other side of kind of the philosophical spectrum, we have approaches like relativism, constructionism, constructivism, interpretivism. So these are broad perspectives, and some refer to ontology and some refer to epistemology. But this side basically views reality as mind-dependent. So this is saying that there is no independent, objective truth that sits separately from our constructions about the world. What is real and true will differ across time and context. So this position really places researchers as actively involved in the production and reporting of knowledge, and our beliefs and our biases will inevitably shape the research. And it's probably important for me to clarify that when I'm talking about this idea of reality, what I'm really talking about is a social reality. So we're not talking about verifying gravity. We're kind of talking about verifying our constructions around our concepts and phenomena that are often unobservable things to us. So if we kind of come back to the garden metaphor, relativism or constructivism or interpretivist approaches would kind of be like looking at that garden through a prison cell. So you can see the garden, you can see what's out there, but you've actually got no way of going out and verifying that is the truth beyond what you see. So you can't leave your prison cell in this instance. You can't go walk out in the garden. And there's actually no way to tell that it's not a projection. It's not some really nice painting that looks really real, or if it's a real image. And then what the person in the cell sees next to you might be different. And there's no way to see what they're seeing because they're in their own cell. So it's basically saying that our social reality, what we view as truth, is constructed on our own perceptions and our own beliefs. It's mind dependent. And then we kind of have this middle position, which is referred to sometimes as critical realism, post-positivism, contextualism. And all these carry sort of different connotations of what you would have to do in those philosophical approaches, but broadly can be grouped as sitting between these two ends of the spectrum. And the claim underlying these positions is that there is a reality that exists independently of our constructions around it, but our knowledge of this reality is always subject to our own biases and hence fallible. So again, we come back to our kind of analogy of a garden or a kind of nature. So this would be like we're looking at a tree or we're looking at this garden, but we're looking at it through a light prism. So how we hold that prism, the angle we look at it from, where it sits is going to slightly change and skew our perception of that reality. If we could just remove it, we could see it perfectly. It's out there, it exists, but we can never remove the lens through which we see things. So basically, with these approaches, what we're doing with appropriate methods, rigorous research methods, is trying to get closer to reality, but we'll only ever have an approximation of it. We'll never completely see our social reality in an unbiased way. So that's probably a lot of isms to throw at you on a Monday. But just broadly, what we're looking at is the relationship between whether we think constructs, phenomena are real, whether they exist independently of how we construct them, and then how we come to know about those constructs. So qualitative research kind of sits to one side of this spectrum, unsurprisingly. So we often see, at least at an epistemological level, the recognition that how we come to know about reality and whatever our view is on that reality, whether it's real or not, we always kind of acknowledge that we're going to view that through our own lens. It's going to have some sort of bias, some sort of interpretation based on our previous history, maybe our expertise, the knowledge we've already got over a topic. And this kind of highlights two key areas of qualitative research. So this is subjectivity. So researchers bring their own beliefs, biases, and experiences to a research project, and particularly when we're talking about the data analysis. And then reflexivity, or the requirement to be reflexive. So this is critically reflecting on the knowledge we produce and our role in producing such knowledge. So it's not the case that it's kind of like qualitative research is subjective and I can't do anything about it. Yes, we do bring biases, and yes, they can be really difficult to kind of get rid of. But what we should be doing as good qualitative researchers is thinking about, well, where am I coming from? And is this potentially shaping the way I view this? And this is sometimes where working with others or having co-authors kind of challenge your thinking. And it's not that there's a right or a wrong answer in a lot of the times, but just kind of challenge it challenge your perception on it and think about things in a different way is going to help us kind of deliver the most robust research account. So the question becomes, I guess, which approach do I pick? Should I go with critical realism? Should I have relativism, post-positivism? What's the right one? There's no real right or wrong approach. It's really just about coherence in your research account. So like I said, just making sure that if you've stated a position, you're trying to take steps to follow that in your other aspects of your method section. And often we already have assumptions that we carry into our research projects because these are pretty big questions. They're about, does reality exist independently of us? And probably something we all kind of have a bit of a predisposed position towards, maybe based on our prior research experience or just based on our views generally, or the views of our co-authors. So we often already have these assumptions. We just haven't necessarily explained those. So a lot of the time you can identify the approach that you're already adopting by thinking about the research questions you want to ask and what are they focused on. And where does your research study sit in your broader research project? Is this a qualitative paper to set up a measure, which is going to be used for experimental trials? Well, okay, you start thinking through, if I assume one thing in one study, does that hold across the rest of the studies? If this is a qualitative study to then develop quantitative research tools, well, maybe I have the view, at least ontologically, that there is a reality we can get at. Maybe it's not the case. So it's just worth thinking through kind of where does your study sit in kind of your context of your other studies, especially when you're doing a PhD thesis, for example, and it might be one component of many studies. And also, what are the research questions you're interested in asking? So just for a quick summary of that first part around methodological coherence. So it's become increasingly important to demonstrate methodological coherence in qualitative research accounts. For example, the top journals in sport and exercise psychology, when you go for, instructions for authors, it has a statement. You must state your philosophical position or this paper will not be accepted. So it's at that point now in our field, at least. I'm not quite sure in other fields where it's at, but it's obviously growing in popularity for needing to state that. Qualitative accounts are generally underlined by acknowledgement of researcher reflexivity. We bring biases to the research account, and we really need to try to reflect on the biases that we do bring. And it's not important which approach you pick, just that it's coherent within your research account. So remember that it's not necessarily about which philosophical position it is. Is that an appropriate one for the decisions you've made, the research questions you're asking, the type of data you're collecting, and the conclusions you're trying to draw from your research account. So I'm just going to quickly pause there. Does anyone have any questions while I take a sip of water after all those isms?
I've just popped one into the chat. You kind of already started to answer it as I was typing it out. But just whether or not you've got any recommendations around how we actually start this kind of process, how to find that approach that sort of fits for us, because I'd imagine it'd be a little bit of a murky spot to kind of navigate.
Yes, absolutely. So that does remind me, I will throw in the chat now just a resources document, which links to some areas or some papers which I've drawn on a lot in textbooks. With regards to an overview of philosophical approaches, I generally find qualitative textbooks, particularly introductions around qualitative methods. So you'll see in the resources document, I've talked about the Brown and Clark one from 2013. They give a pretty good overview of the different approaches. You might also consider looking up journals that have been, or articles that are published in journals you might be looking at and seeing kind of what decisions authors have made. Is it a similar study to what you're doing, and seeing what approach they have. And there's just kind of having a discussion with your co-authors. Really, a lot of it comes down to the ontological question. And because that's really where it differs epistemologically, as in how do we come to know about this reality, is quite similar across most qualitative projects. It's the ontological one. So that's where it's probably thinking, well, what do I assume about social reality? Are there so there's a quote to maybe this helps kind of highlight the difference. So there's a quote by Joseph Maxwell, who's a critical realist, and he says mental concepts are as real as rocks. So like that's literally the statement he's making. So do we view constructs as real, as these independent constructs that would exist independently of how we kind of believe and view them, or do we view them as mind dependent? So especially when we're dealing in kind of this non-observable mental phenomena that most of us are probably researching, it's an important question to think about, and especially if you're using this to set up quantitative things, that's often going to be underlined by a kind of realist ontological position. So it's just one of those things you start thinking through, and then often talking to your co-authors and our supervisors if you're a student is a really good start as well, because you can kind of bounce ideas off each other.
Awesome, thank you.
It's all right. Okay, so I'm going to move on to sampling here. So I guess when it comes to collecting qualitative data, there's a range of different ways we can go about it. So these are kind of the different approaches we might consider. As you can see, interviews and the variations of interviews are kind of a big portion of that. But we've also got things like focus groups, looking at books, media, digital, journal diaries, observations, visual methods, or sending out online or email and getting written accounts back. But by far the most popular, at least in sport and exercise, but I would hazard to guess this is the case across most fields, is semi-structured interviews. So semi-structured interviews is where we have a guide, we have an interview guide, but there's flexibility within that to ask different questions, to ask probing questions, to follow up. It gives you that bit more of an exploratory approach while still having a guide to draw on. Structured interviews are a bit different. They're going to be where you ask the same question in the same order every single time. So you're not necessarily have that flexibility, whereas open or conversational interviews are kind of the other end of the spectrum where there is no guide and you're just kind of having that conversation and seeing where you go with it. So there's different approaches. But I think for most semi-structured interviews would be the most common. Focus groups are another one to highlight as quite a popular type of data collection strategy where you have multiple people partaking in an interview. The benefit being that you can sometimes have those participants bouncing off each other and kind of probing each other in a sense by providing different reflections around the same phenomena. It's also worth thinking about, and excuse the shameless plug, but it's also worth thinking about when you do the data collection. So we've, in our research group, really focused especially on sport performance. So a lot of the research we've conducted is around optimal psychological states during sport. So basically, you might have heard of people being in the zone, for example. But this idea of, when you're performing well in sport and kind of what's the psychological state going with that, we've really tried to focus on getting data that's close to that phenomena. So what I mean is we try to interview a participant within 7 days of that experience to get kind of a chronological recall of what's going on and try to get rich detail. So it's something worth thinking about whatever field you're in. If you're looking at someone's experience of something, think about when you might be conducting that interview or collecting that data. So for example, are you asking someone about their experience of conducting a PhD a day after they submit or 30 years down the line? And that perspective is going to be very different, purely based on time as well. So just something worth thinking about, how close you can get to the phenomena. So with regards to sampling and the strategies we take with regards to sampling participants, it's slightly different to a quantitative approach. So often we're drawing on much more purposive sampling strategies rather than, I guess, random sampling. So you're not looking necessarily, well, you can sometimes, but you're not really looking for a random subset of the population. You're kind of looking for particular participants who can meet your criteria or answer your research questions in the best way. And these are participants who can generate insight and in-depth understanding of the topic of interest. And this really speaks to the conclusions we're trying to draw from qualitative research as opposed to, I guess, quantitative research. So I guess when we think about generalizability in quantitative approaches, we're often talking about representativeness. So, we sampled X amount of participants, and that's meant to be some sort of representation of a type of population. With regards to qualitative approaches, we're not really saying, these 10 participants that I interviewed in sport represent all athletes. What we're saying is that the concepts and the constructs that we develop or refine or understand as a product of that research account can be generalized to others. So it's more generalizing the concepts, constructs, definitions, theory, whatever's produced on an account to others, rather than kind of generalizing the results as some sort of statistical representation. And I think I put a paper in the resources document, which probably explains that a lot better than I just did, but Brett Smith has written about it. So if you look for Smith in that resources document, you'll see who I'm referring to. So there's a range of different purposeful sampling strategies you can take, and these can be combined as well. They don't necessarily always sit independently. So maximum variation is when we're looking for cases that differ within the sample, so diversity within the sample. Extreme cases, so this is essentially where we're looking for outliers of the phenomena that we're interested in. Typical sampling might be your typical cases. Homogeneous sampling is when we're looking for members of a distinct group. Event sampling is when we're sampling around a particular event or a particular situation that's occurred. And then there's theoretical sampling. So this might be relevant to the theory you are developing, particularly in like grounded theory approaches, you'll draw on theoretical sampling. And these can be combined. You might draw on event sampling with maximum variation, for example. You want people in particular situations, but you want to get diversity in that experience of the situation. Then typically it gets divided into purposeful and convenient sampling strategies. So convenience being you're sampling based on accessibility. One of the common ones is snowball sampling. So do you know anyone else who might be interested in participating? But a lot of the time, these two things actually influence each other. So Maxwell says here, every decision will be affected by time, cost, and access. And that's just the realities of doing research. So you do often need to kind of think also what's most convenient and accessible. And just because something's convenient doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't fit a purposive sampling strategy. So often what you'll have is your sampling criteria, and you're just trying to fit that. And if something's a bit more convenient and a bit more accessible, that's obviously going to be beneficial. So just something to be aware of that. When it is a very strict or rigid sampling criteria, it can be quite hard to recruit. And sometimes you do need to bring in convenient sampling strategies to facilitate that. Snowball sampling can be really good because, especially if you don't have a lot of connections within a certain group or a certain phenomena that you're interested in, you can draw on the networks of the participants you're interviewing. So say, for example, I didn't know many athletes, but I interviewed one athlete. They might be able to suggest their team member, who they might be able to suggest another team they played in. So you can kind of draw on those networks organically. So just a quick summary. The sampling strategies depend, what type of data collection technique will answer your question best is something that you want to think about. So do you want to do focus groups? Is there a benefit to doing focus groups over individual interviews? If you do an individual interview, what kind do you want to do? So it's just worth thinking through that. What is the sampling strategy that will provide the richest insights into the phenomena of interest? So think through, what are you trying to get at? What experiences are you trying to look for? So if you're looking for diverse experiences with a certain type of drug, for example, and diverse experiences with that, you don't want to just sample everyone who's had a negative experience. So you're looking for kind of variation within that group if that's your research question. And how will you recruit participants, and what networks can you draw on to help recruit participants? So it's also just worth thinking, how will you go about it? Can you draw on those convenience-based strategies to help sample, draw on snowball sampling, as well as the type of recruitment you do and how you might get them? So for example, with sport, because I was doing event-focused interviews, so we're trying to get really data data that's near the phenomena that's occurred. So within 0 to 7 days, I would often go to events and ask people after the event, because I could maybe get them within a day or two. If you're looking for more longer term reflections, general advertising is probably going to be a really good strategy. So it kind of depends on the type of data that you're trying to collect. Did anyone have any questions before I move on sampling? Whoops.
Can I just double check whether we're able to get a copy of the slides? Is that all right by you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I can put them in now, probably. I can find the chat thing.
No rush to do it now. I can always grab them from you after, just then that way we can distribute it to people.
Cool. I just think I put it in, but we'll see if it's too big for the chat.
Cool. Thanks, heaps.
Cool. That's all right. So I'm going to crack on to doing the interview. So this primarily speaks to doing semi-structured interviews or focus groups because they're the kind of most common ones that you see. But some of these skills are going to be transferable to other types of interviews as well. So I guess as a starting point, and again, what's probably different for, I guess, some quantitative studies, and it's probably one that's particularly relevant for honours students or people thinking about supervising honours students doing qualitative research, is that you've really got to know your topic before you engage in the data collection process. So, when we do survey research, it's obviously you're going to have to go through ethics, and you're going to have a decent understanding of your topic. But anyone can really hand out a survey, and the quality of those survey responses aren't going to differ all that much depending on who did it. Whereas with an interview, the quality of the data in that interview and the richness of the data, and we often talk about data being rich, is going to depend on the person asking the questions. Because if a participant says something that is related to a related construct, but you don't have any knowledge of that construct, but it could be really interesting, you might not follow up on that because you're not aware of it or you don't see that link. But if you're really over the research area, you understand not only your topic, but also kind of some of the related topics and what you're trying to do, it's going to give a much more informative interview that's going to offer a lot more rich data when you come to the analysis. So it's something worth considering that you do need to invest a bit more upfront time in knowing your topic before you do the data collection. Often it means that when you get to write up a discussion, for example, and this is similar to when you, and also a process, a product of going through the results process, but it often means at the back end, the discussion stuff, you've done a lot of that thinking in the data collection and results stage. So it's kind of a slightly different distribution of time and effort with regards to a qualitative project. You want to focus on the big issues, so you don't need to ask every single question ever. Really focus on what are your big questions. If you've got time, you can follow up with individual ones or probe, but you want to, what's the big questions I'm asking? What are the real key ones I'm trying to get at? And then I can go into individual things. You can end up with a lot of data, but it may not be that rich because it might not speak to your research question if you're kind of going off on all these areas that aren't actually that important. You want to use open-ended rather than closed questions. So basically a question that allows someone to answer with more than just a yes or a no. So don't want to ask them a binary question. So for example, if I said, did you feel pressure at this when you took the penalty? They can just say yes or no. Where if I said, describe your experience of pressure when taking the penalty, is going to be a very different response. Each question should address one point. I'll admit I'm terrible at this. I always ask double-barreled questions, but please try to avoid it. So just have one point that you're asking in the question rather than two questions in one because it just confuses the participant. And the type of questions you ask relate to your philosophical approach. So this one, again, can be sometimes hard to unpack and find the link, but let's say you are adopting a philosophical approach like critical realism, which has a big focus on causality. So it really wants to understand mechanisms and actually is very explicit in that qualitative accounts can provide, evidence of causality. You'd be asking questions around the why. Why did this happen? How did this happen? Really focusing on mechanisms. If it's more about experience, maybe it's more about how did you feel or getting more broad descriptions of the experience. So just worth thinking through what you're trying to get. And again, that's really going to relate to your research questions. So your research questions that you'll come up with are often the real starting point for making a lot of these other decisions. So this is the classic funnel in academia, which seems to apply to everything. But with interview guides, you can also kind of think of it as a funnel. So starting broad and coming more narrow. So at the start, you might think about some rapport building. I've got some sporting examples here because obviously my background, but it could be anything. So there's some sort of common ground between you and the participant. You don't have to have these. It can also be quite natural just by the way you talk to them. I also like to go over the ethics again. I think it just sets a really good foundation for the interview. I think it does the right thing as well from an ethics perspective and ensure that they're aware of their conditions. And I think it creates a bit of a safer environment knowing that it can be deleted. They can stop at any time. They can withdraw their data. They're not obligated once they start the interview to finish if they don't want to. So I often start with the ethics as well. So start broad before going more specific. If you do have any sensitive questions, place them towards the middle or the end. I've never really had to do this as much because I haven't had a lot of research where it has that kind of more sensitive nature, but there are a lot of recommendations that you want to try to build that rapport and that trust first, and then place those sensitive questions a bit later. Highlight when it's the last question. So just one last question, and then you ask a question. It just provides the participant knowledge of the interviews coming to a close, provides an opportunity for them to add more if they want to, and also just if they're thinking that they're going to be there forever and they need to get off, and they know it's the last question, they're more likely to give you a better response when they're kind of getting maybe frustrated, thinking, oh, when is this going to end or something like that. And you always provide an opportunity to contribute more at the end. So after that, just one last question, you just say, and is there anything else we've missed you'd like to discuss that you think might be relevant? Often you actually get a lot of talk at the end. Might go on for another 10 minutes at kind of the end of the formal interview when you're in this stage, because they're just kind of like, oh yeah, relax a bit, and they start talking, and you might kind of pick up again. So it can be quite fluent in that way. Obviously, if you've kind of said the interview's over, you don't want to keep recording after that point because you've said the interview is finished. But if you're in kind of this closing down stage, you might still get some interesting data at this point, and the interview might keep carrying on. My experience very broadly with doing interviewing is that depending on the research area, but definitely my research area, most participants really enjoy actually participating in interviews. I know with us, we're talking to athletes. They love their sport. They get someone who's interested in hearing about their experience in sport for an hour. They probably never get that ever. and they really seem to enjoy the experience. So, I mean, it might depend on your research topic, but I think often we perceive that it's really going to be like the participant's going to hate it the whole time. But so many participants have said to me, oh, I really enjoyed that. I never really got a chance to talk to someone about that or think about that or think about my sport in this way. So it depends on the research area, but participants can really, really enjoy that quite engaged data collection method. So just with regards to during the interview, so I guess it can be really easy when you're in an interview, especially when you do it the first few times, to be really in your own head. Like, what am I asking? What should I ask? What's my next question? Am I going to forget a question? So as easy it is to say, sorry, for too many words in the last 45 minutes, as easy it is to say, you just want to try to be present, active, and curious. So you want to just try to be as in the interview as you can and not kind of in your own head around what you're going to ask. Having pocket questions can be a really good way to alleviate this anxiety. So this is where you've kind of got these questions in your metaphorical pocket, which you could pull out at any moment to ask. And there's something that's just broad, going to be broadly relevant to your research area, would make sense when you ask it at any time, but it's just something if you got stuck. But I've never really found myself stuck running out of questions, because if you've got an interview guide, you're going to have plenty there that you can draw on. Just have a backup recorder if you are recording, just because if one dies, you don't want to miss the data. I've had batteries run out, memory cards get full, and if you don't have a backup, you can miss it. And just be aware of how you convey yourself as well during the interview. So there's often power dynamics at play in an interview. For example, if I was interviewing a student at the university and I work at the university, that's a power dynamic. In that case, I wouldn't even want to conduct the interview because of that. But you just be aware of them, even in the position of being in a university student or lecturer. For some groups, that can be perceived as a very powerful position. So think about how you dress, the location you conduct the interview, and your physical positioning. And a lot of the times you might be trying to reduce some of that formality. So doing an interview at a cafe, for example, rather than in like a classroom, is going to reduce that formality. Often we're doing them now over Zoom and stuff, which kind of makes it a bit easier. But they're all things you can think about for the kind of image we're trying to cultivate as an interviewer. I just got a question from Carissa in the chat. I'll probably speak more to coding next time. But I guess during the interview, if someone contradicts themselves, I would just kind of say, oh, that's interesting. You kind of said before this, and now you're saying this. What do you mean by that? And I think it just might allow them to, like you said, if they reflect on it and change their mind. When it comes to coding and doing the analysis, you want to keep the context of the interview in mind when you're doing that. So if they do change their mind and they're kind of quite explicit around, oh yeah, actually after thinking about it more, no, this is actually the case. That's the thing you would focus on more than the initial thing, because the context that they're speaking from is part of that interpretation and that coding process, not necessarily just the words on the page. So I'm going to keep cracking on if I can click through. So with regards to interviewing, it's a craft. It's something you can get better at. It's not just something one person's good at and one person isn't. And some ways you can do that is through piloting. So doing pilot interviews before you start doing your data collection. The pilots are good. You can always use them in your data collection, assuming they meet the criteria. You want to get feedback from co-authors, from supervisors, especially if they've had some experience doing interviews. Listen back yourself and reflect on it. Think, could I have asked a different question? Did I sit in silence long enough? Did I rush in? Did I speak over them? What could you improve on? It is painful to listen to yourself back, so forewarning on that. And transcribing. So if you can transcribe yourself, I should rephrase that. If you have to transcribe yourself, because most people, if they don't have to, won't. But transcription is actually a really good way to improve your interview skills and a really good way to familiarize yourself with the data, which is an important part of the analysis process as well. So it can actually be a real strength when you talk to your trustworthiness, your rigor, your validity, and the quality of your analysis if you've transcribed the data yourself, which I know is quite common, especially for PhD students, is to transcribe the data yourself. So just for the sake of time, I'm just going to quickly skim through this focus groups one. But basically, with focus groups, the key difference is that you've also got to manage the social interactions between the group. So you're more of a moderator than an interviewer. And you can actually use more than one moderator. So especially if it's a big focus group, you might have two people where one's kind of more focused on the interview questions and one's more focused on managing the social dynamics of the group. And what I mean by the social dynamics is looking out for certain dominant personalities or those that are very quiet. So you can have people like self-appointed experts, dominant talkers who kind of take all the space in the room, or silent participants or bored participants who aren't engaging a lot. So you got to think about how we can either, I guess, engage other participants to reduce the domination of one, or engage those that are a bit quiet. So just on transcription, as I noted, transcription is tremendously important as part of the analysis, but it is a very time-consuming process. So somewhere between 3.5 minutes to 6 minutes per minute of audio, depending on if you use some AI to get started. So there's a lot of AI transcription now, which is great, but you'll always need to go through and correct it because it's never going to be perfect. So there's Otter, Teams does it, Zoom does it. There's probably a new AI company every day that I've missed. And then if you're transcribing yourself, I've used Express Scribe before, which is just a little bit of a time saver. You can use hotkeys. If you're doing a lot of transcription yourself, you might get foot pedals to help control it. So there's ways you can cut the time down. But just know that if you are transcribing, it is a beneficial thing for your analysis. Obviously, if you have the funding or the support to have it transcribed professionally, that is something you can do as well. My only suggestion would be maybe just take a little bit longer in the familiarization phase, which I'll talk about in part 2 to make sure you really read and reread the transcripts. If you've conducted the interviews yourself, you're going to have a pretty good understanding though, but definitely spend a little bit of extra in that reading stage. So just with regards to doing the interviewing is a craft, pilot, practice, and reflect. Try to be present and curious. You don't need to ask everything. Just be aware of the additional skills for focus groups, and transcription can be really beneficial towards the analysis and developing your own interview skills. So I'm going to very quickly touch on sample size considerations and then hopefully have a few minutes for questions at the end. So one of the tough things with qual is that there's no real G-power, there's no calculator for working out your sample size, so it can be a bit vague. As a rule of thumb, it's going to partly differ by your field. Typically, for individual interviews, you might be seeing somewhere between 15 and 30. It really depends on the field. There are recommendations that a minimum of 6 is required, but it really depends on a lot of stuff that's going on within your data, and that's what I'll speak to now. So it's really hard to determine a priori, but for ethics applications, for grant applications, you often do. So you kind of got to make an approximation of the upper limit, and then provide a caveat that you can only determine the number once the study is underway, or once you've started collecting data, because that's going to inform your sample size. So often we're making an approximation when we're doing it a priori in something like an ethics application. And you can draw on other studies as well as a guide for that. So data saturation is probably the one most people have heard of when it comes to sample sizes in qual. So it's a widely used and recommended concept within qualitative analysis. And this is the point in data collection and analysis where no new information is produced. But there's been a lot of critiques around around data saturation, particularly when using thematic analysis. And as Lowe states here, it's a logical fallacy, as there are always new theoretical insights to be made as long as data continues to be collected and analyzed. It's also really hard to distinguish when we talk about when are there no new insights and we're the one making that decision and we're the one on certain timelines and probably want to stop data collecting, that it kind of can be quite easily influenced. So it's just be aware of using data saturation, especially if it's an approach that draws on reflexivity or inductive approaches. One of the alternatives that's been recommended, and again, this doesn't give you a firm calculation, it's just a guide, is the concept of information power. So this is basically saying how much information power does your sample hold? And there's 5 facets which are specified, where in some cases it lowers the amount you need, and then in some cases it pushes up the amount of data you need. So you can see it's around your aims, the specificity of your sample, whether you're drawing on theory or not, how good the dialogue is, how rich that data is, and the type of analysis you're using. So if you're using cross-case, using across different cases, or within case analysis. And just as a disclaimer or something to take away, it's not the number of cases that matters, it's really what you do with them that counts. So there's no point having all these participants if it's not good, not a really rich interview, you haven't taken the time of the analysis to really think it through, or it's really surface level. Having less participants is actually going to be better, because if you remember back, when we talk about generalizability and representativeness, we're talking about analytical generalizability. We're not trying to get some statistical representation. So whilst there are kind of recommendations around roughly how many you should have and guides to help determine that, remember that it's really about how you approach that data analysis and what you do with that data that's going to determine the quality of the project. So I'm sorry I had to rush through that last little bit. We're just wary of time. But the slides are in there, the resources are in there with all those papers. So you can read about those in much more detail. Did anyone have any questions?
We've still got a good 5 minutes if there is anything that anyone wants to ask. Be good to have a bit of a chat.
I'm getting tongue twisted by the end.
Not at all. It was wonderful as always. Okay. Can't see anyone putting their hand up, so feel free to sing out if there is anything that you did want to ask. But I just wanted to bring everyone together to say thank you very much to Dr. Matt Schweickle for coming along today and giving, as always, a wonderful presentation around qualitative interviews and collection and theory. Always manages to make some pretty complex concepts just work really well. And so this is, as Matt mentioned, just part 1 of 2. So I'm really hoping that everyone is able to join us next time round as well in the same time slot for our MoCRE professional development meeting. Sorry, I just got distracted by looking at all of the pop-ups in the chat. So I think based on all of the thanks and thank you and wonderful and thank you and super helpful, I think we can all pretty much agree that that presentation went down a treat. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation to come along today, and we look forward to seeing you again next time round. Before I officially wrap up, was there any last minute burning questions? I think I've got 3 minutes if anyone wanted to sneak a last minute something in before we finish up. No, I think we're good. Well, thank you very much for